On Saturday, July 23rd, that was Saturday? I think it was. Let's look at the old calendar. That was Friday. My apologies. Last Friday, Uniswap put out a blog post. Uniswap Labs, put out a blog post that their front end will now be limiting access to certain tokens that they feel could fall under the scrutiny of securities laws. Of course, there's a little difference here that needs to be noted. Uniswap Labs controls the most popular front end for Uniswap, the protocol. Uniswap, the protocol, lives online on Uniswap or on Ethereum blockchain. Can't be altered. It just exists there. You can add any token, and once it's on the smart contract, it lives there. It's uncensorable. The front end, though, that most people interact with to touch that smart contract can be changed, and it's owned by a US-based entity, and so they have to comply to securities law. So they decide to delist or block access to some of these tokens. Of course, there's other ways to get around it. You can go to a different front end, or if you know how to use the contract, even from like a command line or something like that, you can probably interact with these tokens. But it shows a tremendous amount of pressure that is moving into the space, the regulatory space, whether it's on the centralized front end or the decentralized front end of cryptocurrencies itself. It's also interesting to note that Uniswap decided to make this change instead of going about it in some other ways. We've seen something like the Maker Foundation, which issues its own stablecoin called DAI, has decided basically to kind of break apart, which falls really strongly within the ethos of decentralization. And a key reason for doing that is you don't really have to face any regulatory pressure if you don't exist anymore. So Uniswap decided to stay together, and they are deciding to kind of limit the things on their front end that they can, so they abide by US laws and sanctions. Really interesting story, a lot to unpack there. Zach, I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I can't recall another example of this from Uniswap Labs specifically. I can't recall another delisting such as this. There may have been some that have occurred in the background, but for this to come out in the way that it came out was really super interesting. You know, we talk about decentralized exchanges as though they're just this free-flowing Wild West, whatever, nothing matters. And, you know, as Will alluded to, at the protocol level, that may be true, but there is still that throat to choke, right? There are still people who are administering these things and who can either choose to comply with certain regulations or maintain that they're decentralized enough to the point where they don't have to. So the fact that this came out when it did late Friday night is really interesting. It's gonna be really interesting to see if a more regulated DeFi will emerge and like a less regulated DeFi will emerge. And it's going to be really interesting to see where these teams start placing their bets. And it seems like on this one, Uniswap Labs is saying, hey, you know what? Maybe if we play by the rules, we can be that next Coinbase, right? In the DeFi space. And that seems to be the calculation. Time will tell, but it's really interesting to see this come out the way it did.
And I want to get your thoughts.
There is this really interesting part that, they kind of delisted these tokens on the front end, but if you are technical enough to use the smart contract like directly without the user interface, then you still can use them. And I wonder, if there are some apparent regulatory reasons Uniswap did that, like, somebody told them, you guys better be on the safer side or whatnot, how long will it take for the regulators to understand that, the front page is not everything that's happening in crypto? And, if at some point they get to the smart contract auditing and looking what's inside of that, imagine the SEC performing the smart contract audit or something like that. Wow, that would be the times to be alive.
I mean, we've seen
really
like,
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Zach. You got
this.
No,
you got it. You do it. No, you got it. You got it. No, you got it.
When is Hayden Adams going to have to move to Singapore is my question. We saw like all these other exchanges, like the BitMEXs and the FTXs of the world. They're like, we're going to East Asia. We're parking out. Securities laws can't touch us here. Hayden, are you going to stay in the U.S.? What's your plan?
That is absolutely the question. I think that I've been wondering that ever since, the old BitMEX stuff came down, right? Like, if BitMEX happens and you're Hayden Adams, are you getting nervous, or are you like, no, we are materially different from how they were operating, and we can prove it in X, Y, Z ways. I was just going to say before, like, we could imagine sort of like blacklisted addresses making their way into DeFi. We've seen some products that have come out that could enable that, right? Okay, you're on the OFAC list, you're on the sanctions list. No, you're an address, you're banned from this decentralized exchange. And people are starting to think about that in those terms, right? How do we make this more compliant than it would otherwise be? But Jen, I'm curious for your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say this story is just another iteration of regulators really stunting innovation and products and exchanges and platforms taking steps back to just avoid regulators cracking down on them. And I just wonder what's going to happen next. I feel like we should just make Hester Peirce the queen of crypto regulation and establish some wonderful safe harbors so that we can actually test and learn, so that we can move into the future. I feel like we're like stuck in the mud. We keep trying to move forward and we're just like dragging our feet because the regulators don't know what they're doing. So I don't know. Every time I talk about regulation, I get really sad and energetic at the same time. Ben, go for it.
No, I was just going to say, down with monarchies. Just generally, we don't need queens. We don't need kings out in this world.